Thank you. Thank you to all family and friends who are here in support of your relatives. Tonight has been put on by funding provided by DEWA, provided by an organisation called Awards for All, to put on a drama workshop, specifically for ethnic women, and myself being deaf and a woman and from an ethnic background. I've used my experience in acting and theatre production to share those skills with the ladies who attended the group. Tonight is very special. There are two ladies who have joined us from Birmingham. They attended a workshop in Birmingham, but they also decided to join us today. And actually, it's the first time that they've experienced what it's like to rehearse before you do a performance. So they've actually rehearsed everything and prepared tonight's performance today. And also to see what it's like to perform in front of an audience. And we really appreciate the fact that you've come to see them perform for the very first time tonight. And it's not so much of a dramatic performance, but it's a storytelling performance. So I hope that you enjoy the evening. Thank you. And just to let you know, we have an interpreter at the back, so as they sign, she will be interpreting, so you'll understand for those hearing members of the audience. This story is about a lady. Her name is Jane Elizabeth Groom. And this is the sign name that we use for her. She was born on the 18th of December, 1839. Born as a young deaf girl. Her father worked in land surveying and selling houses. In 1850, as she grew up, she wasn't very happy. She was then moved to live with her uncle and also alongside her sister, who was also deaf. And they were moved to Manchester to attend a school for the deaf called Manchester Institute for the Deaf and Dumb. And it was based in Old Trafford in Manchester. She excelled in her learning very fast. And because of that, she became a teaching assistant. Jane became a teaching assistant at the age of 14. The deaf children were taught by a gentleman called William Stainer. He was actually a reverend, and he taught deaf children at the school. He was very skilled, and Jane was quite impressed with the way that he taught the deaf children. He'd set up various schools, and Jane attended various institutes, improving her own experience and applying it to her own teaching. Jane then moved on to London when she was about 30 years old. And this was in 1855. Jane arrived at the London School Board. She noticed that the school only had provision for hearing children, but there was nothing available for deaf children to be taught. Jane then started a petition and also asked her colleague, Reverend William Stainer, who'd also worked with her back in Manchester, to come and support her, to assist her in teaching deaf pupils at the school. And the school board, when they saw this, they decided to approve them teaching deaf children. And Jane also, alongside the Reverend, began to teach deaf pupils at the school with hearing pupils. There were about 1,500 hearing pupils, and in other classrooms there were deaf pupils taught separately. And from that, Jane gained a high reputation for her teaching ability with deaf children. In 1880, there was a conference in Milan, and they banned the use of sign language and preferred the education of deaf children to be done via the oral method. They brought in hearing-trained teachers to then take over teaching deaf children using the oral method. Jane observed the oral method and felt that using the oral method was useful perhaps on a one-to-one basis in education, but for a group of deaf pupils, she felt it was not as effective. And because of that, Jane then ended her teaching career. In 1882, Jane then began working as a missionary, teaching spelling and also doing Bible studies for deaf congregations, around about 100 deaf people, twice every week, to congregations of deaf people. In the Hackney area of London. She was quite distressed when she noticed in the area the poverty and the starvation and unemployment experienced by many deaf young people. She contacted the London Association in Aid of Deaf People and set up a ladies' committee to look about the welfare of deaf people and deaf women, how they could develop and build their confidence. Unfortunately, there wasn't sufficient funding to sustain this type of work. Jane, somewhat exhausted, decided to embark and have a break and go to Canada. Jane arrived in Canada in 1883. She noticed that the land was very suitable for settlement. And she realised that there wasn't enough money and the poverty that many deaf people experienced, but felt that Canada would be a good place to emigrate some deaf people to build a new life. The only problem is that the laws did not allow this to take place, for deaf people to come and emigrate into a new country. Jane decided to go back to England and started her well-known famous petition. Jane, through her petitioning, managed to change the laws in Canada. But in order to do this, what she had to do was gain a number of nobles' signatures and also to discuss with different leaders. As part of her campaigning, she did various lectures and talks to hearing audiences to gain funding. She also put on performances with deaf people, and hearing audiences actually, on seeing this, would donate and pay. This also generated more funds. Even the Prime Minister, Mr. Gladstone, donated £100 towards this work. Jane, upon receiving that good news from Canada that she'd been allowed for deaf people to emigrate there, she then set up the first party, which consisted of 10 men and 2 young boys, and they emigrated to Canada. There, they enlisted in work of farming, bricklaying, and shoemaking. And they established and settled themselves there. Although the local people in Canada criticised her, and Jane read about this in the newspapers, but this did not deter her. She went back and founded a second group of 24 deaf people and their families to again emigrate to Canada. And there, that community began to grow and thrive. In 1890, unfortunately, the funding that they'd used eventually ran out. And Jane, with her deaf sister, had to return back to England. Jane came back to England in 1892 with her sister. They used to sit and do dressmaking, but often remember Canada and the deaf community that they left behind. And they remembered how that community was thriving and how they'd managed to establish themselves and know that the deaf community would continue for generations to come. Although poverty still existed in London, and obviously that's what broke her heart initially to start this work, but her and her sister often spoke together about the fact that now, due to this work, sign language would still continue. They tried to overthrow it, saying that oralism is what should be the way forward, but they knew that sign language would continue. Unfortunately, Jane passed away in 1908 at the age of 69. As we've looked upon the story of Jane Groom and we look at what she achieved, she became a teacher for deaf children, which was her passion, and using sign language, and she continued in this career for 30 years. Secondly, she worked as a missionary within the church, and she enjoyed teaching deaf congregations and supporting them and supporting the deaf community. She then also continued to set up a new community in Canada where deaf people were able to build a better life. And also, she was the first deaf woman to start a petition and campaign to government leaders. At a senior level. So when we look at what she achieved, she's truly someone to be admired. That was the first time that and they only practiced it today and performed it today. Thank you so much. If you want to ask them any questions about the workshop and what they learned, here's an opportunity, and there's also food for you to enjoy.